All right, buckle up. It's gonna be a long one, folks. So, tonight's the July full moon in Capricorn. It's the end of Cancer season, going into Leo season. Shout out to all my fellow July Cancerians out there. Recently, I just turned 24, and, a lot of life stuff is happening, including this space that you see behind me. This is a brand new recording space that I've set up for the purposes of this channel and making this podcast and making my videos. So you'll see a little bit more of this space and you'll see it develop over time, but this is what I've got right now. And it's been a while. It's been a while since I have posted anything. It's been about a month. My last post was in June, showing off my Pride Month altar. And this video was also supposed to come out in June, but I think I kind of needed a little bit more time for it to marinate. And that's because there's just a lot of energy that went into just the entire making of this topic and conversation and how I was going to present it and what I was going to say. And it wasn't that I had a lack of things to say. It was more like I didn't quite know how to word these things. And so I took some time to do a little bit of research and took some time to just kind of de-stress from some of the emotional things that, are covered within these topics. And I came back and here I am in a whole new space with a mic and a bunch of new stuff. I'm still recording on my potato of a phone, but we're making progress, okay? So today's topic is a big one, and one that is likely to get some people potentially upset. I don't think most of the people within my particular audience and subscriber base are going to be the people particularly upset by this video, because most of them are people who can likely relate to some of these criticisms that I'm going to be presenting and some of the alternative ways to look at divine gender and stuff like that. I digress. We'll get into that later on in this video. But because this is such a large topic, I'm going to be leaving timestamps so that way you can just click and jump around and listen to these different parts at your leisure, or listen to it broken up. But before I get into that, I should probably get my introductions out of the way. So, hello everyone, my name is Eddie, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Wolfsbane Witch. And this is episode 2 of the Wolf Bites podcast. If you haven't seen episode 1, I highly recommend it, just because it'll add a little bit of extra context to this conversation, but it's not necessary. Anyway, the Wolf Bites podcast is a podcast where we sink our teeth into the unknown by discussing all things spiritual, magical, philosophical, political, paranormal, and more. And today's episode, if you haven't guessed by the title, is going to be covering gender essentialism in spirituality, witchcraft, and also the alt-right pipeline that happens within spirituality and witchcraft circles, and how gender essentialism is a tool used for that. So viewer discretion is advised for themes of transphobia, homophobia, sexism, Western colonialism, fascism, and stuff like that. If you're not in the headspace for that type of thing, please click off this video now, because that is going to be the main current of today's conversation and all of the things being presented within it. Also, a fair warning for people who have little kids around or who might be like in a workspace or something like that. There will be some swearing within this video, so if that's not something that you want to have people around you hearing, just pop in an earbud or listen to this at a different time. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into a couple prerequisites that I think are important before we really dive into this topic. Okay, so prerequisite number 1. For this conversation, I'm going to ask all of us to put on our big black pointy hats of nuance and also our big witch pants. Because we need to be mature and measured, thinking, rational, and nuanced individuals if this conversation is going to be fruitful or productive in any way. And in the case of this conversation, nuance denotes the ability to be open to new perspectives and paradigms that you may have previously been unaware of, or that just don't belong to you. And where maturity means that you can discern your own place, roles, privileges, and responsibilities within this conversation, and with that, be able to hold your unique space in this conversation with dignity, kindness, and willingness to connect on a human level, both with the subject matter being discussed, with myself as the one presenting the subject matter, and with anyone else who chooses to leave their own unique thoughts in the comments. With this being said, any and all disrespectful, inflammatory, or hateful comments will be promptly blocked and deleted. You don't have to agree with me, but in layman's terms, just don't be a dick about it. Which leads me into prerequisite number 2. This is meant to be a conversation and a bit of a analysis or critique. It's not necessarily meant to be an end-all be-all. It's not meant to be a demonization or canceling video. It's not meant to make anyone feel lesser or bad about themselves or their practices. Although I do hope that what I say will inform you enough to potentially change your mind if you have somewhat problematic beliefs, or at least to get your gears turning on these subjects so that way you can think for yourself, I don't expect everyone to fully embrace everything that I say, even people who generally agree with what I'm saying here. And I think that's a good thing because I'm just one guy, and I don't have all the answers. Especially not to something as big and complex as gender essentialism, fascist pipelines, and cis heteronormativity and sexism, and, all the fucking problems in the world. But what I can do is I can provide a safe space to talk about these problems. I can provide well-researched information, logical analysis. I can provide my own experiences and feelings from being marginalized, and also I can provide the experiences of other marginalized voices. And most importantly, I can provide new directions for us to explore with our magical and spiritual principles. So that way, if we do so choose to try to unpack any cis heteronormative practices, or just want to explore with our paradigms, we have somewhere to start. And this is important to me because within this conversation, I know that I very well might stir up some inner shadowy feelings in people. And so by providing these paradigms and perspectives and nuances, I not only wish to shed light upon some of the more dark or potentially toxic things in other people's practices or ideologies or whatever. The goal is to reach my hand out in solidarity with others to help them come to conclusions that are more inclusive and diverse and loving. And in general, I think most pagans want those things. But sometimes what we believe in our spiritual world and what we believe in our outer world don't quite align. And this can lead us to be susceptible to predation by alt-right extremists. But I'll get into that soon. The goal here isn't to demonize anyone's ignorance or mistakes or beliefs, even if they find out that their beliefs might have been potentially problematic. The goal here is to point out ideological weak points wherein we can grow, self-assess, and strengthen ourselves and our connections to others. And that's the intention of this discussion and all of the information, thoughts, and experiences shared within it. Because when we know better, we can do better. And when we are united, we can do better together. All right, so we've got the main prerequisites out of the way, and don't worry, this entire recording's just going to be filled with caveats, but we got the major ones out of the way, so let's begin sharpening our fangs to begin to really sink our teeth into the main topics of today's video. I think a good place to start with this is to talk about why this conversation is necessary to have in the first place. The first reason why talking about gender essentialism and cis heteronormativity and stuff like that is important when it comes to witchcraft and spiritual and pagan communities is because, simply put, there's no witch pope. There's no grand pagan jury, and there's no enlightened new age guru that every pagan or spiritual person or witch listens to. Instead, what our communities are groups of diverse people, practices, and cultures that all share some relatively loose commonalities. The fact that there is no grand law or authority figure within witchcraft and paganism means that we as witches and/or pagans get a lot more spiritual freedom to explore and to see what works for us and to become interconnected with others who might be different from us. Overall, it's a good thing. But we need to keep in mind that because we don't have an external authority figure to tell us what we should or shouldn't believe, it is up to us to self-govern ourselves and to make sure that we end up in ideologically positive positions. Essentially, what we've done is we've traded the overall ease but limitations of ideological subordinates for the overall freedom but challenge of ideological sovereignty. And if we're going to take up this mantle of the challenge of sovereignty, then we have to remember that a good sovereign does not rule mindlessly and thinks just as much for the good of those around them as they do for themselves. What I'm trying to say here in a less poetic sense is that we are responsible for the good and safety of ourselves, of course, but we're also responsible for the good and safety of our communities. And this has become increasingly important as of the past few decades, especially because the internet has shifted us into a global society. And with that, it's shifted our communities into global communities. This means that now we're responsible for a lot more community than just a couple witches in a local coven. And let's be real, that's predominantly the way it was in the 80s and 90s when most of the more experienced modern witches became witches. But now we're seeing an influx of younger Gen Z and soon Gen Alpha witches who are coming into the community through the internet. And this can make things complicated for a myriad of reasons. Myriad. Nice. But one of the most difficult issues to combat is the issue of the spread of misinformation, and even worse, the co-opting of this misinformation, or of magical and spiritual practices in general, by science deniers, modern medicine deniers, grifters, wannabe cult leaders, and usually within one or more of those groups, alt-right extremists, aka fascists. Fascists are alt-right political extremists who will use pseudo-pagan, scientific, witchy, or alternative belief structures as ideological gateways in order to groom people into rationalizing with and, over time, sympathizing with whatever they happen to want you to believe. But usually it's not really anything good. And because there is no witch pope to tell them to leave or to tell us what to do about it, it's up to us to unite and combat this threat together, and to make our communities a place that is ideologically safe for both people already in the community and people just starting out. When there's no ultimate authority to tell these threats to leave, it's up to us to come together and make our communities a place where this form of predation is not only unacceptable and unwelcomed, but is actively defended against through the very framework of what we as a community of diverse, mature, and kindred individuals stand for. Which is, or should be, the upholding of our ability to continue to exist and thrive as a diverse community. And we want to do this because fascism is innately, by design, anti-cultural, anti-diversity, anti-woman, anti-people of color, basically human. And I need to make this very clear. Being anti-human is fundamentally non-spiritual. So with that being said, why do these fascists even gravitate towards New Age spirituality or paganism or witchcraft in order to propagate their beliefs? Why is this an effective place for them to seed their ideology? Because let's be honest, if it didn't prove effective for them to be here, they wouldn't continuously keep finding new ways to keep coming in here. And as per usual, there are just countless reasons as to why fascists and fascism can take root within witchy and pagan and spiritual circles, but I'm just gonna list off a few that I think are the most relevant, especially in this particular conversation, but also kind of just in general. This is not an end-all be-all list. This is just a sort of composited list of things that I think make our communities or people entering our communities more susceptible to being kind of guided into the alt-right pipeline. So firstly, before we even start, we should keep in mind that the people who are most vulnerable to being indoctrinated into fascist ideologies are people who are ill-informed, isolated, unaware, and privileged. Privileged, in this case, denotes any individual who, whether willingly or not, has traits that are engaged with social standards that are aligned with the general core values of Western colonialism. And this can include things like whiteness, maleness, cis-heteroness, wealth, or I guess richness. I don't know. I'm going with the nisses, I guess. I don't know. It seems a little unnecessary. All right, I'll go. But yeah, so let's keep those factors in mind. But I'm gonna just list off 4 reasons why I think fascists target the witchy and pagan spiritual communities. And the first is that political extremists tend to target people who are in vulnerable mental or emotional states. And this coincides very nicely with people who are new to witchcraft or paganism or alternative spiritualities and paradigms, because shifting religious, spiritual, or ideological paradigms, especially if you're doing so for the first time, is a very vulnerable and a very impressionable process. And if you're in a state of questioning your place in the world, or if you are going into spirituality to find and uncover these secret hidden truths of the universe, well, fascists are going to be ready and willing to provide all sorts of answers to all of your questions, regardless of whether or not they're in your best interest, or whether or not they're true or rooted in reality as it is. That's not really the point. The point is that they will give you the absolute answers that you are looking for. And usually the answers are very simple and accessible and will feed on certain innate biases of yours, especially if you are a person who has any form of privilege. Reason number 2 is that people who are open to witchcraft, paganism, and New Age spiritualities tend to be open to more alternative forms of medicine. And this on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. Things like herbalism, wild foraging, aromatherapy, and essential oils aren't inherently problematic in any way. But when they're paired with the alt-right anti-medicine and anti-science propaganda that's often pushed covertly in these communities, it can lead someone down the fascist pipeline. And not only can this be a danger to their literal physical health, but being anti-medicine and anti-science is a fundamental step into the gateway of other alternative scientific and biological beliefs rooted in the alt-right ideology. Stuff like biological essentialism or evolutionary psychology, which, spoiler alert, play a key role in cis heteronormativity, sexism, and the perpetuation of homophobia and transphobia. But I digress. Reason number 3 why fascists tend to target, especially people who are new coming into witchcraft, paganism, or New Age spirituality, is that a lot of us are young, impressionable, not well informed within these topics, and what's that? Oh, well, the invisible elephant in the room behind me here, he wants me to mention that not only are they young and impressionable and not well informed, they also tend to be predominantly, well, white. And if we know anything about fascists, it's that, well, they kind of have a type. Okay, jokes aside, you can see how this group can potentially be a political extremist's playground for recruitment. Even more insidiously so within spiritual communities, because fascists very well know that our spiritual beliefs color the lens in which our morality sees the world. And with it, it affects the very fabric of how we view, behave towards, and treat ourselves, others, and reality itself. And this isn't just an issue for newbie witches or people who are just starting out on their magical or spiritual journeys. Fascism will also utilize the traditional, established, and more mainstream New Age and religious beliefs. Which leads me into my 4th reason why fascists will utilize modern witchy and pagan circles. And that's because there's a lot of focus in these circles on revitalizing the ancient ways or by keeping traditions. And there's this propensity within this sort of romanticism towards letting things kind of get severely socially, linguistically, and sometimes politically outdated, and resisting the potential need to re-examine or criticize these often, as I said, romanticized belief structures. And many of these outdated or potentially problematic belief structures fall well within line of political conservative values, or can be easily modified to fit into the fascist ideology with little to no effort on the part of the fascists themselves. And this is incredibly dangerous because it gives the fascist a sense of moral ambiguity within their stances. And it can also provide them a sort of spiritual bypass form of deniability because, hey, they're not the ones who invented this religion or belief structure. This is just the ancient law. And you wouldn't argue with the wise ancient ancestors, would you? And with practices like magic, paganism, and spirituality being so deeply entrenched in this romanticization of long-lost traditions and lineages and relics of hidden wisdom, even experienced witches can kind of become attached or a little precious about these practices, regardless of whether or not they truly align to the current understandings we have of both magic and spirituality, and also concrete objective reality. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that fascism has talons. These talons are long and they dig in deep and they hold on with a ferocious might. However, these talons are not as strong as they are piercing. Therefore, they need to target the weakest of flesh in order to claim the victory of their hunt. Fascists are not strong enough to target a truly radical individual. See Wolf Bites episode 1 for context on what that means. Their talons will just shatter on contact. So instead, they go for the young, the impressionable, those they can coax, those they can target. And what they target are scar tissue, our anger, our trauma, our fears and implicit biases. And they also target our soft underbellies. They target our ignorance, our naivete, our innocence, and even our compassion and sympathy, if we let them. And when we hold belief structures that can be practically copied and pasted into an alt-right playbook, well, we're sitting ducks to be taken over by alt-right extremists. But more importantly, I think, we're faced with the realization that, holy shit, our beliefs can be copied and pasted into an alt-right playbook. Maybe that's not such a good thing. And in the case of gender essentialism, we might even ask if our beliefs are truly based in nature, or if our ideology is simply nature-themed. For every form of oppression out there, there have been a multitude of ways that it has been rationalized and internalized through spirituality or pseudoscientific beliefs. And this is just not anything new. Western colonialists have been doing this shit since the fucking days of yore. But nevertheless, spirituality is still one of the many ways oppressive narratives get internalized or legitimized into someone's ideology. And as witches, pagans, or spiritual people, which my audience mainly consists of, big shocker, that involves us, because we are spiritual people. Or, in the case of my atheistic witches out there, we're people who deal with a community in which consists of a lot of spiritual people and practices that are largely tied to some form of ancient religion or modern spiritual concepts. And this can impact us whether or not we see them as psychological models or as something outside of ourselves. No matter what paradigm your beliefs fall under, they still shape your morality and therefore your behavior. Alright, so at this point I've rambled on about fascism for I don't even know how long, and I haven't even touched the main topic of today's video, so honestly, if you're watching at this point, I'm gonna assume you either really like what I have to say, really hate what I have to say, or you fell asleep or something like that. But regardless, I am going to humbly award your patience with the topic that you came to this video for. Yay! You're welcome. Alright, so gender essentialism. What even is that shit? Gender essentialism is a belief that people are born with different natural essences, which are determined by their biological sex. Gender essentialism is often linked to the idea of biological essentialism, which is a belief that gender is innate and biologically determined. In layman's terms, sex equals gender. That's the narrative that biological and gender essentialism fall under. This ideological framework is inherently trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex exclusionary just from the jump. But it's also problematic for the way it marginalizes cis women and promotes the Western colonial ideals of patriarchy and biological determinism. And I bring this up because witchcraft, spirituality, and paganism kind of has a gender essentialism problem. Alright, so little interactive experiment here. I want anyone who is willing to do so, who happens to be listening, to just stop and pause this video and write down somewhere, or just make a mental note, of 3 main key characteristics that you would assign to the concept of the divine feminine. And then I want you to do the same thing with the divine masculine. 3 key characteristics that you would assign to the divine masculine. And I want you to pick words that you think really encapsulate what it is to be the energy of divine feminine and masculine. And then when you're done, I want you to close your notes, and I don't want you to look at them until later on. I'm going to mention them 2 times after this in this video, but forget about them until then, okay? Got it? Good. All right. So let's finally take that bite. Where does gender essentialism pop up in witchy and pagan spaces? How does it manifest, get legitimized or internalized? And how does this feed into cis heteronormativity and the fascist pipeline? All shall be revealed. Hopefully. Alright, so I'm kind of biting off a little bit more than I can chew here with this wolf bite, but that's because I'm kind of using this as a sort of road opener of sorts to the broader conversation of these topics. So this is not meant to be an end-all be-all to any of these opinions, criticisms, or topics discussed. This is just meant to kind of put my foot in the door and to get people talking about these broader ideological weak spots, issues, and spiritual bypassing and stuff like that. Basically, due to the fact that I literally just have no possible way of covering everything in this subject matter, I've broken down this section of the video or recording into 3 main factors that I think contribute the most harm. So I've broken it down into divine gender polarity, spiritual bypassing, and something I'm calling the romanticized other. And I've put timestamps to all of those issues and criticisms regarding those issues in the description and within this video, so you can check those out whenever, in whatever order you would like, and find them easily for your viewing pleasure. So, without further ado, let's go for the jugular and talk about the concept of divine gender polarity. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Of course, the trans witch is going to try to fucking cancel Wicca. But that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, gender polarity isn't even really a Wiccan concept. It's been used in stuff as ancient as Hermeticism and as recent as the law of attraction. So the more accurate criticism should be, oh great, the trans witch is trying to cancel all the laws of the universe just to fit their lib-sal agenda. Alright, obviously I'm joking here. I'm not trying to cancel anything. This is not meant to be a cancellation of any of these traditions, except for maybe the law of attraction, but that deserves its own video, to be honest. What I'm really trying to do here is critique. Because call me a bleeding heart anarchist, but I don't think that any religion or ideological framework is exempt or above criticism, including my own. And I also believe, remember, pointy hats of nuance, that just because we are criticizing potentially harmful or problematic parts in a belief structure does not mean the entire belief structure is evil and needs to go down. That's a very, binary, hey, on brand for this conversation, but it's a very binary way of good versus evil thinking, and it doesn't really provide us with a good structure of moving forward with complicated issues. The goal here is not to demonize or dismantle entire belief systems, but rather a call to address specific problematic beliefs within the belief structure for the overall betterment, inclusiveness, and longevity of said belief structure. Basically, it's a call to throw out the bathwater and save the baby. And that's the angle that I'm coming at all of these criticisms from. So, to paraphrase something from non-binary Wiccan author Yvonne Aburrow, do we exist to serve our tradition, or does the tradition exist to serve us? And I think that's a very poignant question to keep in mind as we continue to discuss divine gender polarity. So let's begin by defining what I mean when I say divine gender polarity. Divine gender polarity is a spiritual and sometimes magical concept wherein there are inherent universal energies expressed in everyone and everything. And these energies are complementary opposites. They're kind of like each other's missing half, if you will. And the typical narrative for the divine gender polarity is that these inherent energies can be boiled down into traits similar to what we would describe as divine masculine and divine feminine. Ideally, within this framework, the goal is to find some sort of balance between these two complementary opposite extremes in order to be a healthy, whole, and spiritually balanced individual. So, what's the problem with that? How does that tie into the alt-right or cis heteronormativity or gender essentialism? To answer that, let's break apart and analyze some of the problematic subtextual components that tend to run through ideas of divine gender polarity. Number 1, it uses biological essentialism within its symbolism. We've all seen it somewhere, those correspondence lists that tell you that wands and athmes are masculine phallic symbols of power and projection, while cauldrons and chalices are feminine symbols of the womb of creation and receptivity. And we would be straight up kidding ourselves to pretend like this is not steeped in symbolism that's in line with the gender essentialist sex equals gender, and gender equals male or female, and male or female equals feminine and masculine type of logic. And we would be utterly lying to ourselves if we called ourselves an ally and then looked a trans woman in the eye and told her that a penis is inherently a male or masculine symbol that could never rationally be linked to femininity or to feminine sexuality. You see, the problem with the phallus and the womb imagery is that it's prescribed a very specific gendered symbolic meaning, which is often justified by it being, hey, just natural, just an irrefutable way things are. It's just a part of nature because, after all, men and women make babies. Right? Well, I mean, tell that to, I don't know, a gay trans man who has had children, or literally any non-binary parent ever, and see how far that argument gets you. To prescribe the fact that a masculine object has to be related to a phallus, or that a feminine object has to be related to a womb, is inherently gender essentialist. Number 2. It paints masculinity and femininity as natural opposites. This idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus is a fundamentally incorrect, sexist, and dangerous viewpoint that has been used to fuel sexism and the separation of men and women for decades, if not centuries. And in a Western patriarchal colonialist society that many witches live in thanks to, well, colonialism, we need to keep in mind that these ideas of natural opposites tend to overvalue one side of the dichotomy and devalue the other one. And this leads me into point number 3. The divine gender polarity exclusively relies on traditional gender roles and stereotypes in order to define what is divine feminine and what is divine masculine. Okay, so let's go back to those notes that I asked you to take earlier, and those are the notes that I asked you to take on the traits of the divine masculine and feminine. All right, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark here and guess that some of you may have written something along the lines of passive, receptive, intuitive, emotional, loving, compassionate, motherly, inward, or healer in order to describe the divine feminine. And you may have wrote something like projective, creative, forceful, assertive, protective, powerful, logical, outward, or warrior to describe the divine masculine. And if you find that your responses don't fit into these categories, congratulations, we're going to talk about you at the end of the video. But now, look, I'm not going to make any particular comments about what you may or may not have answered or what that means to you. For right now, I just want you to think about why you may have chosen what you chose to describe these divine energies, and if these are based in your personal understanding of these energies or in a paradigm. Just something to think about. But let's carry on with point number 3. So, traditional gender roles and stereotypes are tools of the patriarchy. Like, period, point blank. They are meant to keep men and women in their place and to not question those places because, after all, they're just natural, right? Yeah, so along with this whole gender as expressed by stereotyping what is feminine and masculine, we need to understand that these feminine and masculine traits are often put into categories which one side of the binary traits are exalted while the other half are devalued. This is something called psychological patriarchy, which is a term talked about by Terrence Real, author of How Can I Get Through to You?, which I would highly recommend you read as a supplement to this talk. I'm going to be leaving a link to that in the description. And look, I know that some of you are about to be typing away in the comments, but divine feminine is not devalued, and my response to that is...
Are you sure about that?
Look, I know it seems like the divine feminine is not devalued, especially in a community of, like, literal goddess worshippers, but I think this is because the traits labeled as masculine and feminine are rarely explicitly negative in the first place. It's not like you're gonna see something as explicitly sexist as divine masculine means strong and smart, and divine feminine means weak and stupid. Instead, what you're gonna see is the sexist devaluing of femininity through traits more akin to those associated with benevolent sexism, wherein the feminine is devalued through infantilization or biological determinism. Have you ever heard someone say something like, men just aren't as emotional as women, they're more logical, or women are better at caring and tending to children, or men are natural-born leaders, or women are more in tune with their intuition than men? These are all examples of benevolent sexism. Benevolent sexism is a form of covert sexist rhetoric which often disguises itself as a complimentary statement. But within these complimentary statements, there's usually a subtext which indicates the affirmation of patriarchal gender norms. So, although we don't literally describe the goddess as a weak, feeble domestic creature, we still do describe her in a way that seems to fill in the gaps of the exalted grandeur of the divine masculine traits. Where he is the brilliance of day, she is the stillness of night. Where he is the active, she is the passive. And while these opposing traits are something that arguably everyone might be able to experience, to attribute these particular traits with masculinity and femininity is questionable and not helpful. The final point I want to make about divine gender polarity is probably my most controversial point, and it's that it treats masculinity and femininity as a pinnacle of divine human expression and divine balance. And the invisible elephant in the room wants me to mention something again, but treating the traits of the traditional gender binary as a universal spiritual law inherent to everyone is kind of a cis supremacy narrative. And that's a pretty heavy statement from an elephant that weighs like 0 pounds, but I think the elephant is kind of right. When we tell people that everyone, regardless of their gender or lack thereof gender, has divine feminine and masculine traits in them, what you're saying is essentially everyone naturally has traits that can be associated with the traditional roles of men and women, but nobody naturally has traits associated with every other possible divine gender expression. When everyone has divine feminine and masculine in them, but no one other than queer people have divine agender, divine demigirl, divine pup gender, divine fae gender in them, what you're doing, whether intentionally or not, are treating traits that are associated with traditional cisgenderedness as a natural standard. And every other divine gender in comparison as second class or somehow less inherent to humanity than that which can be defined by binary standards and traits. When everything is broken down and categorized into masculine or feminine, where does that leave room for queer people to explore and define their own divine genders without trying to fit them into a cis-normative framework? Furthermore, when feminine and masculine are so opposingly defined by polarity, where does it leave room for the feminine to be active in her own right, without it being attributed to her inner manliness? And where does it leave room for the masculine to be compassionate and loving within his own right, without it being credited to him being in touch with his inner woman? Alright, so, I don't know. But we've made it out of the topic of polarity, so yeah. If you're still here by now, I am genuinely astonished. Are you alright? Do you have a fever? If not, let's continue to the second main way gender essentialism shows up within the spiritual and pagan communities, and that is spiritual bypassing. Yay. Just kidding, it's really bad. It's not fun. Okay, so spiritual bypassing is a topic that I'm pretty sure most of you have already heard of, so I'm not going to spend too much time defining what it is. Instead, I'm going to give you a couple of the main ways that it's targeted at trans people in specific, but this is not necessarily a trans exclusive list, because let's be honest, racism, sexism, ableism, basically every form of oppression is just another tentacle of the overarching politically extremist, colonialist, patriarchal, capitalist system that rules the world. So all of these things are kind of interconnected. That's kind of the whole point of intersectionality. So although what I'm going to be talking about is mainly arguments aimed at trans people, this can be applied to almost anyone. Alright, so jumping right in, the first and most classic form of spiritual bypassing is denial and distraction. This is a little method I like to call, "These aren't the droids you're looking for." In the case of this discussion, this form of spiritual bypassing is usually expressed by something like saying, "The divine feminine and masculine has nothing to do with gender," or "This is just a metaphysical symbol, it's okay if it doesn't include you." Both of these are common ways that people will bypass their responsibility to empathize with others and meet them with compassionate answers to difficult and potentially paradigm-shattering questions. And I think the fact that these questions are potentially paradigm shattering is why some people will bypass in these situations, because it's far easier to shrug off these difficult questions as irrelevant or to deflect them than admit that your best answer might just be, I don't know. The next common bypassing narrative that's usually thrown towards people asking questions about being marginalized or othered, either in everyday life or in a spiritual context. Typically, these are the falsely enlightened New Age type responses. And they'll usually come at you with something like, "This reality is an illusion," or "There's no such thing as race or gender, sexuality, or even disability, because we are all one collective transcended soul." Or, "We must transcend our physical bodies in order to become truly spiritual, enlightened beings." And while all of those statements sound loving and spiritual on the surface, the subtextual meaning of all of these statements is basically telling the marginalized individual or the person asking questions on behalf of them that their concerns about racism, ableism, sexism, or transphobia or homophobia just aren't real. Or that it is real, but it's just some silly, petty human worry that enlightened souls like them don't need to deal with or pay attention to, and you should just join them and be enlightened too, so that way you don't have to care either. And most insidiously is the subtextual message that our physical bodies and experiences are somehow non-spiritual or unimportant, and that we must deny our physical world and humanness in order to be spiritually fulfilled. As if our isolation from the very experience of life that gives us our soul in the first place is somehow lesser than some pseudo-enlightened state of divine neutrality. All right, now let's get on to the last common method of spiritual bypassing, and that will be victim blaming. This one's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I don't think it needs any deep analysis as to why it's insensitive or how it, shirks the responsibility off of the people who use it as a weapon. So I'm going to give a few examples of the ways it plays out, and then I'm going to just go on to the final topic in regards to transphobia in witchcraft and spirituality. So here goes. Someone's saying, "You chose this trauma to happen to teach you something," or "You signed up for this when you incarnated," or "These are just parts of your soul contract," or "You've brought all this negativity onto yourself. It's just your karma or your bad energy that's causing this, not real oppression." All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, and now we're at the final parts of this, I guess, critique section of the chat. And in this section, I want to discuss something that I don't have a proper word for, so I'm going to call it the romanticized other. The romanticized other is what I'm using to describe the phenomenon in which ostracization and stereotypes are flipped in a sort of overtly positive direction, which frames the marginalized individual as an object of admiration, desire, or in possession of some deeply mystical attributes not held by the quote-unquote average, usually meaning cishet white, person. This form of romanticization of marginalized groups and identities is nothing new. In fact, it's a really common trope in Western colonialist mythos because, as I said, intersectionality. Usually this type of thing has been applied historically in a more racist rather than transphobic way. So, for example, in racism, you have something like the noble savage trope that's often painted upon indigenous people. But in terms of transphobia, which, of course, the struggle between racism and transphobia are not the same struggles, but again, intersectionality, there are common ways in which oppression or oppressive tactics tend to play out. So in terms of transness, this can take the form of a few things, such as the idea that trans people are inherently more magical or liminal because they are this cosmic link or bridge between masculine and feminine or male and female. Or this idea that trans people are more naturally predisposed to magic because in history they used to be shamans or they used to be worshipped, so they must be inherently super magical or spiritual or something. And while these concepts may sound very complementary, overall, what they're still doing is separating the trans body, spirit, and the individual away from humanness and into something metaphysical and not human, not one of us. And while it isn't as blatantly transphobic as dehumanization in the opposite direction, it still adds a layer of separation between trans people and the quote-unquote normal cis people. And although it is historically true that trans people have always been here in witchcraft and spirituality, and may have been shamans, or may have even been worshipped, I don't think it's fair or necessarily appropriate or accurate to project these often ancient examples of transness onto modern magical or spiritual trans people who haven't openly claimed that paradigm as part of their spiritual practice. Because while one trans person may very well see themselves as a divine link between male and female, and that's completely valid, but not every trans person will. And believe it or not, non-binary people exist too, so that wouldn't work for them either. And people like me who have never really felt like they've had a different gender pre-transition. You know, I don't see myself as a liminal divine bridge between man and woman because I don't think I really ever truly was a woman. I think I always was on the inside exactly who I am now. I just didn't have the words for it for a really long time. But that's just my experience. And so it's important to meet trans people for who and what and where they are. Just like it's important to meet every person in that same genuine way. But yeah, so we did it. That was a lot. We did it. Yeah. Congrats, everyone. Congrats. Go get a snack. We're almost done. Yeah, if you've survived this long, thank you for being a strong little soldier. I'm tired as hell, but we're almost done. We're almost done. So this is the final chapter of the discussion, and this is where I'm going to be giving sort of new ways to recontextualize and unpack some of these issues that I brought up, and then I'm gonna close it out after that. So let's get into it. So despite what you might be assuming, I'm not about to go all divine gender abolitionist on you. As a trans person, I know very well that gender matters. And as a pagan pantheist, I also know that spirituality and finding personal, multifaceted ways to explore identities like divine gender is an exceptionally freeing and recentering process. I'd never want to take that away from someone or wish we stopped doing these practices. Instead, what I think we need is a mixture of a few different things. Firstly, we need to redefine polarity in terms that are more accurate to nature, because biological essentialism ain't it. And there are plenty of better examples of polarity that are not only more accessible, but are more accurate to what real polarity actually looks like. I'm gonna mention Yvonne Aburrow again because they just have a lovely body of work on inclusive Wicca, and they managed to provide a multitude of ways to recontextualize different concepts, like the concept of polarity. As I've mentioned earlier, the goal of these criticisms is to throw out the bathwater and save the baby. So know that there is a reason why I didn't criticize polarity in general, but rather the specific concept of divine gender polarity. And this is because polarity can work in a lot of different ways outside of the concept of masculine and feminine strict binaries. And Yvonne gives several different examples of how this might play out. So I'm just going to go through a bullet list of a couple of these. Like I said, all the links in the description. Check it out yourself if this is something interesting to you. But here we go. So some examples of gender neutral or more accessible way of looking at gender polarity would be to kind of separate it into something like self and other, material and immaterial, day and night, introverted and extroverted, manifest and unmanifest, and lover and beloved. And of course, if divine gender truly is just symbolism to describe projective and receptive energies, then why not just use the terms projective and receptive, or active and passive? Surely it would lessen the confusion and make it easier to understand the meaning of the spiritual symbolism that divine masculine and feminine are there to represent. And after all, isn't the comprehension of the spiritual principles that are used in the symbolism more important than the language we use to describe them? But I digress. Anyway, the final take that I'm going to add is kind of a radical one, and it's a little bit shamelessly ripped from Lily Alexander's video titled, "What Are Women?" Lily Alexander is a trans video essayist here on YouTube, and she made this video where she talks about how definitions of gender have changed over time and how gender critical or TERF ideology has used definitions of gender in various ways to exclude trans women. At the end of her video, she comes to a conclusion that I think can be reworked into a way that we can combat limited ideas of what defines divine masculinity and divine femininity. And that is to step away from a prescriptive model and into a descriptive model of looking at what masculinity and femininity means in general or means to us. Now, in terms of gender definitions outside of magic and spirituality, I agree with Lily's take completely as is. But obviously, it's going to look a little bit different to interpret it into a witchy or spiritual context. So in order to illustrate how I would do that or how I would explain how it would work, I'm going to use my own path to illustrate what I mean. So firstly, when we label things as masculine or feminine in a prescriptive way, what we're doing is we are limiting the ways in which these descriptive terms can be expressed and talked about. For instance, when we say that one object is inherently linked to the feminine or masculine by virtue of it simply being that object, we stifle our ability to meet that object for what it is and for how it interacts with us and our particular energies and our particular reality. An example of this in my own practice would be my magical jewelry. In my practice, I wear a lot of magical bracelets and rings and necklaces and all sorts of magical jewelry. And out of all of the pieces of magical jewelry that I have, I think maybe only one of them gives me a mild sense of feminine energy, but even that doesn't necessarily feel like feminine in the traditional sense either. And so when I wear my magical jewelry, to me, it makes me feel pretty connected to my personal understanding of my divine gender, which is masculine aligned, which means that when I wear my jewelry, these bracelets and stuff, I feel masculine as fuck. But I also acknowledge the fact that when other people see me wearing these bracelets, they might think something different, like, oh, hey, nice, that guy's in touch with his feminine side. And that's okay, because I understand that what jewelry means and represents to them is fundamentally different than what jewelry means and represents to me. But this doesn't have to mean that one of us is inherently right and wrong and one of us is more natural than the other. Because that's ridiculous. Because I understand the fact that gender is a social construct, which means that what makes something a particular gendered energy like masculine or feminine or non-binary or any other form of gender variant is gonna be completely a personal, subjective, and relative experience. But just because gender is a social construct, it doesn't mean that it's not important or relevant to someone's life. There's a damn good reason why so many people have flocked to paganism and spirituality, specifically women, to engage with certain divine traits of their femininity. And that's because women, and hell, pretty much fucking everybody else too, are sexually and personally repressed by a lot of these systems of patriarchy and gender essentialism and biological determinism that plague them. And so a lot of them come to a more radical goddess worshipping or woman empowering centered alternative belief structure like paganism, spirituality, for mostly feminist reasons. And paganism has been a safe haven for women and marginalized people and even men in many respects. And one of the objections from people within this sort of crowd I think I might get, and maybe in some others too, is that their definition of divine feminine is fundamentally different from my version of divine feminine that I describe through the traditional gender roles. And I want to talk about that. So let's go back to those notes that you might have had. And I'm going to talk now on if you had notes that describe traits of feminine or masculine that don't necessarily align to the traditional gender roles or stereotypes that I was talking about earlier in the first part. So let's say, for instance, you wrote something like empowering to describe the divine feminine. This is kind of you already viewing your interpretations of the divine feminine through a more descriptive lens. But I also want to add something, just to make it very clear, that just because some traits might align with both someone's experience of femininity and their descriptive experience of it and traditional gender roles does not inherently mean that that person is doing something cis heteronormative or being transphobic or falling into some gender essentialist, like, woe is me, I'm, falling into the trap of gender paradigms. Because obviously there are many mothers who worship the mother goddess. There are many people who find a lot of empowerment within soft and feminine things. I mean, there's a bunch of different aesthetics dedicated to very soft and feminine things. And a lot of that is kind of popular within the communities that intersect with people into witchcraft and usually paganism as well. The issue of the gender essentialism critique that I was making earlier is not that if you align in any way to a traditional gender role or find empowerment in it, that you're bad and evil. What it's saying is that it is a transphobic concept or a supremacist-like concept to assume that traditional gender roles are the only option to have to describe something. And I think a lot of us already view things in a very descriptive way anyway, even if we believe that we do align to a polarity concept. I know a lot of people who have described very contradictory experiences with the divine, and I've had contradictory experiences with the divine as well. As a polytheist, pagan pantheist, hey, say that 5 times fast. I've had many contradictory experiences with energies which were supposed to be one way, but turned out to be another. When working with Dionysus and Pan, they've taught me way more about classically quote-unquote feminine topics like love, emotions, the inner self, and relationships. And working with Hecate and Freya have been instrumental in my journey of personal strength and empowerment. In each of these relationships with the divine, I let them approach me, or I approached them for what and as they chose to be, and what and as the relationship became. Had I been under a very prescriptive paradigm, I'm unsure as to what kind of spiritual lessons I would have learned, or from who they would have came from. I'm glad, however, for my contradictory experiences. I think it keeps me grounded in the reality of just how fluid and personal our own interpretations of energy, and especially gendered energy, can be. And honestly, when I explain them as contradictory gendered experiences, none of these experiences genuinely struck me as particularly feminine or masculine. Occasionally, there would be some when I was working on things regarding my own gender, but typically the divine don't present in overtly gendered ways to me. So yeah, that's about it. For now, at least. I might revisit some of these concepts in more vivid detail, like on their own in the future, but I'm thinking that the next episode of this podcast will be something a little bit lighter and perhaps a little less potentially controversial. Please spare me. I can only handle so much. I am but a simple little lad. But yeah, so I'm not sure what the next subject will be yet. If you do have any ideas on that, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. If you have any comments whatsoever, any 2 cents that you want to add into this conversation, as long as it is not bigoted or disrespectful, go ahead, leave it below. I would be interested to see what you have to say. And if you are a queer or a trans or gender nonconforming individual and you would like to add your 2 cents into this as a sort of video, consider yourself like tagged or something, go ahead, please. I definitely want to hear more trans voices on what they think of these concepts because, as I said, I'm just one guy, right? These are my opinions, and of course I tried to make them educated opinions and as educated as I can be. But at the end of the day, you know, I think that having a larger pool of people to listen to is important. Other than that, I hope this video was at least mildly thought-provoking or, you know, helpful in some ways at kind of helping you ask some internal questions or think about things that you maybe haven't thought about in a little bit. Yeah, and I don't know. I've been meaning to make this video for a while, and I wanted to make this for Pride Month, but kind of missed it, and so I thought now is a pretty good time. And of course, fucking Mars is conjunct Uranus, so you know shit's about to go down. But I'm hopeful that my audience are nuanced and mature witches, and I think that they genuinely are, and I think that we can have a mature conversation out of this. And yeah, I just haven't really seen anyone lay out the cards and really talk about this other than like kind of vague mentionings of being mildly uncomfortable with certain concepts. So I decided to, you know, be that guy and just kind of let it out there and, you know, like I said, start the conversation. I know I'm not the only one. Like, I'm not trying to claim to be like the guy to fucking start the gender conversation in fucking witchcraft. That's not what I'm trying to talk about. There's been people talking about this for fucking forever. Gay people and trans people have existed for forever, okay? I'm not the first one to talk. They learned how to speak in 2024. No. But, you know, I know that some people who are watching this, I am the first trans person they may have had contact with within this community or have heard from within their perspectives within this community. And so, you know, I do try to be mindful of that. So yeah, I'm tired. The elephant in my room is passed out in the corner. He's sleeping. So yeah, I'm gonna go to bed and hopefully have this up by this full moon tonight. Take care, and I will see you in the next video of whatever I make. And of course, if you have any suggestions or would like me to elaborate on anything, if you have any questions, anything you want me to address, please let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one. Blessed be.